Welcome to another video. Today I'm taking you back to the year 1858. This is the story of Cyrus Lovett, a boy. A black boy who threw himself into a frozen lake, while the air itself felt like death, and pulled 3 drowning souls from the icy grip of the water. This is a heavy one, so take a breath, really listen, before we go any deeper. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're listening from. Your presence here, your voice, it's what keeps these stories breathing instead of letting them fade away into silence. Let's begin. January 14th, 1858.
Hold steady now.
A small Virginia town called Millbrook. A frozen lake. And in an instant, 3 people crashed through the ice. 2 of them were just children. The third, a schoolteacher. As their screams tore through the freezing air, as their bodies were swallowed by water, so cold it burned like fire, every single white man standing on that shore did nothing. Absolutely nothing. They stood frozen, not by the cold, but by their own helplessness. None of them knew how to swim, but someone else did. A 12-year-old black boy named Cyrus Lovett. A boy the law called property. A boy who, just 5 months earlier, had been whipped until his back was raw for the crime of helping a white woman pick up her fallen books. A boy who had every single reason in the world to stand on that shore and watch. To feel nothing. To let them sink. But he didn't. What Cyrus Lovett did on that frozen January afternoon didn't just save lives. It echoed through newspapers across the northern states. It forced an entire town to stare into a mirror and face a truth about themselves so ugly they couldn't look away. And in the most dramatic way possible, it proved that the people they called inferior possessed a kind of courage they themselves could never dream of. This is the true story of the boy who dove into that frozen lake and the 3 souls he pulled back from the edge of death. But to truly feel this story, to understand what happened on that winter day, we have to go back. Back to the summer of 1857. Back to a hidden river on the Whitmore plantation. Back to a secret a mother whispered to her son in the water. Cyrus Lovett was born into slavery in the spring of 1846. His mother, Bessie, worked in the big house on the plantation of Thomas Whitmore, a tobacco farmer whose temper was as harsh as his hand. Cyrus never knew his father. The man was sold away to Alabama before Cyrus could even form a memory of his face. All he had was his mother's words, that his father was strong and kind, and that he sang songs in a language carried across the ocean from Africa. That was it. That was all. In the world of American slavery, families were torn apart like paper in a storm. The Whitmore plantation sat about 3 miles outside Millbrook, Virginia. Not the biggest in the county, but big enough. Thomas Whitmore owned 42 enslaved people, most of them bent over tobacco fields from sunrise until the light failed. Cyrus was too young for the brutal work of the fields, so he was given lighter tasks. Carrying water, feeding the chickens, running messages between the big house and the cramped, dirt-floored cabins where his people lived. And every Sunday, while the white folks sat in their pews praying for their own souls, Cyrus and his mother slipped away to the river. The Ashford River ran along the edge of the Whitmore property, hidden behind a thick veil of willow trees. It was there, in those secret waters, that Bessie taught her son to swim. She had learned from her own mother, who had learned from hers, reaching back across generations to a time before the chains, when their people lived free on the banks of great African rivers. But swimming was dangerous knowledge for an enslaved person. A slave who could swim was a slave who might try to cross a river and run for freedom. A slave who could swim was a threat. So Bessie made Cyrus promise. "Promise me you'll never tell. This is our secret," she whispered. "Our one small piece of freedom in a world that has stolen everything else." Every Sunday, Cyrus swam. He learned to hold his breath until his lungs burned. He learned to move through the water like a shadow, silent and invisible. He learned to open his eyes in the murky darkness and see. And most importantly, he learned that in the water, he belonged to no one. The river didn't care about the color of his skin. It knew nothing of whips or chains or laws that declared him less than human. In that river, Cyrus Lovett was free. By the summer of 1857, Cyrus was one of the strongest swimmers in the whole county. But nobody knew it. To the white people of Millbrook, he was just another slave boy. Invisible, insignificant, property. Millbrook was a town of about 800 white people, but the enslaved population nearly doubled that number. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The kind of town where your family name decided your worth. And the kind of place where the line between white and black was carved so deep that crossing it could cost you your life. At the top of Millbrook's world stood three families: the Witters, who owned the most land; the Ashfords, who owned the most slaves; and the Millers, who owned the most power. Judge Cornelius Miller was the most important man in town. He decided which runaway slaves would be sent back to their owners and which might go free on a technicality. He decided who would hang and who would walk. His word was law, and everyone knew it. The judge had a wife named Margaret, a cold woman with a permanent frown etched into her face. They had twins, a boy and a girl, both 10 years old. Thomas Jenner and Charlotte Miller were raised to believe they were better than everyone. Better than the poor whites who worked with their hands. Better than the immigrants with their strange accents. And absolutely, unquestionably, better than any black person who had ever drawn breath. The Ashford family had a son named Edmund. Edmund Ashford III was 14 in the summer of 1857, and he was exactly what you'd expect from a slave-owning family's heir. Cruel, arrogant, drunk on his own imagined superiority. Edmund had a gift for finding new ways to torment the enslaved people around him. He'd trip them as they walked by. He'd spit in their food when no one was looking. He'd hurl names at them, ugly names. And he always got away with it. But there was one other person who would shape the events of that January day. Her name was Elizabeth Harrington, and she was unlike anyone Millbrook had ever seen. Elizabeth was 23 and had come all the way from Boston to teach at Millbrook's one-room schoolhouse. She had radical ideas about education. She believed children should think for themselves, not just memorize Bible verses. She wore her hair shorter than was proper. She asked questions that made the local men squirm. And worst of all, in the eyes of Millbrook's polite society, she seemed to believe that black people were actually human. Elizabeth Harrington had been in Millbrook only 3 months when she made the mistake that would change everything. It happened on a hot August afternoon, right on the main street in front of the general store. Elizabeth was carrying an armful of books when she stumbled on a loose board. The books went flying, scattering into the muddy street. Before she could even bend down, a young black boy was there, gathering them up in his arms. It was Cyrus. He handed the books back to her carefully, making sure the pages weren't damaged. And Elizabeth did something no white person in Millbrook had ever done to Cyrus Lovett. She looked him in the eyes, not through him, not past him, at him. "Thank you," she said, and she smiled. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. A white woman, a black boy. A moment of simple human kindness. But in Millbrook, Virginia, in the summer of 1857, 3 seconds was enough to ignite a firestorm. Edmund Ashford saw the whole thing. "Hey!" he shouted, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "What do you think you're doing, boy? Who said you could touch her things?" Cyrus didn't answer. He had learned long ago that answering back to white people only made things worse. He kept his eyes down and tried to walk away. But Edmund wasn't finished. "I'm talking to you," he said, grabbing Cyrus by the arm. "You think you can just go around touching white ladies' things? You think you're some kind of person?" Elizabeth stepped forward. "Leave him alone. He was just helping me." Edmund turned to her with a sneer. "You must be that Yankee schoolteacher. Let me give you some advice, ma'am. Down here, we don't let our animals get too familiar. It gives them ideas." That night, word reached Thomas Whitmore, his slave boy, touching a white woman's belongings, looking her in the eye, acting like he was equal to her. In Whitmore's mind, this was an offense that demanded punishment. He called for his oldest son, William, who was 16. He handed him a leather whip. He told him to teach Cyrus a lesson he would never forget. 20 lashes. They tied Cyrus to a post in the barn and tore the shirt from his back. William Whitmore hesitated for a moment before the first strike. Just a moment. But then he saw his father watching, and whatever humanity might have flickered in his eyes died. The whip came down. Once. Twice. 3 times. By the 10th lash, Cyrus had stopped screaming. By the 15th, he had stopped moving. By the 20th, blood ran down his back and pooled in the dirt beneath his feet. Bessie found him there an hour later, still tied to the post, barely conscious. She cleaned his wounds with water and dressed them with herbs she grew behind the slave quarters. And through her tears, she whispered something to her son that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "What you did was right," she said. "Helping that woman was the right thing to do. And the right thing always has a price in this world. But one day, son, one day, that price will be paid back. With interest." Cyrus didn't understand what she meant. Not then. He was too busy trying to survive, trying to heal, trying to make sense of a world where kindness was punished and cruelty was rewarded. But he would understand soon enough. The autumn of 1857 was brutally cold. By late October, frost covered the ground every morning. By November, the first snow had fallen. By December, the lake on the Miller property had frozen solid. Lake Miller was the judge's pride. It was the largest body of water in the county, nearly a mile across. In summer, it was a place for picnics and fishing. But in winter, when the ice grew thick enough to walk on, it became something else entirely. A skating rink for the wealthy families of Millbrook. Every winter, the Millers hosted skating parties on the frozen lake. The ladies would arrive in their finest fur coats. The gentlemen would show off their imported skates from New York. And the children would race across the ice, their laughter echoing in the frozen air. Cyrus had never been allowed on the lake. Enslaved people weren't permitted to use it for fun, but he passed by it every day when he went to fetch water from the well on the Miller property. And every day, he would stop for a moment and study the ice. He wasn't studying it because he wanted to skate. He was studying it because he was thinking about escape. The Underground Railroad ran through Virginia, and Cyrus knew that freedom lay somewhere to the north. He also knew that the fastest route north crossed Lake Miller. If he ever decided to run, he would need to know where the ice was thick enough to hold his weight and where it was thin enough to break. He would need to know every crack, every weak spot, every place where the water moved beneath the frozen surface. So every day Cyrus watched, and every day he learned. By early January, he knew the lake better than anyone in Millbrook. He knew the ice near the western shore was nearly 2 feet thick, solid enough to hold a horse and wagon. He knew the ice in the center was thick, but covered with a layer of frost that made it slippery, and he knew the ice near the eastern shore, where an underground spring fed warm water into the lake, was dangerously thin. There was a crack on the eastern side, a crack that started small near the shore and grew wider as it stretched toward the center, a crack almost invisible under the fresh snow that had fallen the night before, a crack most people would never notice. But Cyrus noticed. On January 13, 1858, Margaret Miller sent out invitations for a skating party to celebrate her twin's 10th birthday. The party would be held the following afternoon, starting at noon, on the eastern shore of Lake Miller. The eastern shore. Right where the crack was. Cyrus heard about the party from the house slaves who worked in the Miller mansion. He heard the guest list. All the most important families in Millbrook. He heard about the decorations, the food, the musicians, and he heard about the location. That night, Cyrus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the crack in the ice. He kept thinking about the people who would be skating right over it. And he kept thinking about what would happen when the ice gave way. Part of him, a part he wasn't proud of, thought about Edmund Ashford falling through. Edmund, who had humiliated him. Edmund, who had caused him to be whipped. Edmund, who called him an animal. Would it really be so bad? That part of him whispered, if something happened to people like that. But then he thought about Elizabeth Harrington. The teacher who had looked him in the eyes. The teacher who had smiled at him. The teacher who, according to the house slaves, had been invited to the party. And he thought about the children, Thomas Jr. and Charlotte Miller. Spoiled and cruel like their parents, maybe, but they were still children, 10 years old, younger than Cyrus himself. He made a decision. In the morning, he would warn someone about the crack in the ice. The morning of January 14th dawned gray and bitter cold. Heavy clouds hung low over Millbrook, promising more snow before the day was out. The temperature was in the low 20s. Cold enough to keep the ice frozen, but not cold enough to seal the crack near the eastern shore. Cyrus was sent to the Miller property early to help with party preparations. He carried boxes of decorations from the main house to the lakeside. He helped set up tables on the frozen shore. And all the while, he looked for an opportunity to warn someone about the ice. His chance came around 10 o'clock when he spotted Mr. Johnson, the elderly overseer of the Whitmore plantation. Mr. Johnson was not a kind man, but he wasn't the cruelest either. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd give the enslaved workers a few extra minutes of rest. Sometimes he'd look the other way when they took food from the fields. He was, Cyrus thought, the closest thing to a reasonable white man in all of Millbrook. Cyrus approached him carefully, keeping his eyes down and his voice low. "Mr. Johnson." "Sir," he said. "The ice on the eastern side of the lake. There's a crack. The underground spring makes it thin there. It might not be safe for skating." Johnson looked at Cyrus with irritation. "What are you talking about, boy?" "The ice, sir. It's dangerous. I've been watching it all winter." "You've been watching it?" Johnson cut him off. "What business do you have watching anything? Get back to work." "But sir, if people skate over that spot." "I said get back to work." Johnson's voice rose to a shout. "And don't you ever let me catch you giving advice to white folks again. You understand me?" Cyrus understood. He had tried to do the right thing, and once again, the right thing had been thrown back in his face. He walked away with his head down and his hands shaking. Not from cold, but from frustration. He had warned them. No one could say he hadn't tried. The guests began arriving around 11. Carriages rolled up to the Miller estate one after another, each carrying members of Millbrook's finest families. The Wheaters came in their black carriage with gold trim. The Ashfords came in their new carriage from Philadelphia. Dozens of others came too, eager to celebrate with the most powerful man in the county. By noon, nearly 40 people had gathered on the eastern shore of Lake Miller. The ladies sat on benches near warming fires, sipping hot chocolate and gossiping. The men stood in small groups, discussing business and politics, and the rising tensions between North and South. And the children, bundled in their warmest coats, strapped on their skates and headed out onto the ice. Cyrus watched from a distance, standing near the bonfire where he had been assigned to keep the flames burning. He watched the children glide across the frozen surface. He watched them spin and fall and laugh. And he watched them drift closer and closer to the eastern end of the lake. Elizabeth Harrington arrived late, around 12:30. She came alone, on foot, wearing a simple wool coat that was clearly not expensive enough for Millbrook society. Margaret Miller greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So glad you could join us, Miss Harrington. We were worried you might not come." But Elizabeth smiled politely. "I wouldn't miss it, Mrs. Miller. The children have been talking about this party all week." She walked to the edge of the lake where some of the older children were teaching the younger ones to skate. And that was when she noticed Cyrus standing alone by the fire, his eyes fixed on the ice. For a moment, their eyes met. Elizabeth saw something in his expression that troubled her. Fear, maybe, or worry, or something else she couldn't name. She thought about walking over to him, asking what was wrong. But before she could move, a voice rang out across the lake. "Hey, everybody, look at me." It was Edmund Ashford, standing near the center of the ice with his arms spread wide. He had skated farther out than anyone else, showing off. "I bet none of you cowards are brave enough to skate to the other side." "Come on, who's with me?" Thomas Ginder Miller, eager to prove himself, raised his hand. "I'll go." His sister Charlotte, not wanting to be left behind, joined him. "Me too." Elizabeth Harrington frowned. She had spent enough winters in Boston to know that ice wasn't always as solid as it looked. "Children," she called out, "maybe we should stay closer to the shore." But Edmund was already skating toward the eastern end. "Come on," he yelled over his shoulder. "Don't be scared." Thomas Ginder and Charlotte followed. And Elizabeth, sighing with resignation, decided to go after them. Someone needed to make sure they didn't do anything foolish. Cyrus watched them go with a growing sense of dread. They were heading right toward the crack. Right toward the thin ice. Right toward disaster. He looked at the adults on the shore. Surely someone would stop them. Surely someone would call them back. But the adults were busy talking among themselves. Judge Miller was deep in conversation with Thomas Whitmore about a land deal. Margaret Miller was complaining to the other ladies about the difficulty of finding good house servants. No one was watching the children. No one except Cyrus. He thought about calling out a warning. But who would listen to him? He had already tried to warn Mr. Johnson, and that had gotten him nothing but a scolding. If he shouted now, in front of all these important people, he would probably be whipped again. Or worse. So he stood there, frozen by his own helplessness, and watched the disaster unfold. It happened at exactly 1:21 in the afternoon. Edmund Ashford was the first to hear it. A sound like a gunshot echoing up from beneath his feet. He stopped skating and looked down, confused. What was? He never finished the sentence. The ice beneath Thomas Ginder Miller cracked and gave way without warning. One moment the boy was there, skating forward with a smile on his face. The next moment he was gone, swallowed by a hole of black water that seemed to open like a mouth. Charlotte screamed. She tried to skate toward her brother, tried to reach him, tried to help. But the ice around the hole was already breaking apart. Before she could take 3 strokes, she fell through as well. Elizabeth Harrington didn't think. She didn't calculate risks or consider options. She simply acted. She skated as fast as she could toward the 2 drowning children. She got within 10 feet before the ice crumbled beneath her, and she too plunged into the freezing water. 3 people. 3 seconds. And then silence. On the shore, the screaming began. Margaret Miller collapsed to the ground, shrieking her children's names. Judge Miller tried to run onto the ice, but 2 other men held him back.
Cornelius, you can't!
The ice won't hold you.
My children!
The judge fought against them, tears streaming down his face.
My children are in there!
But no one moved to help. No one could move to help. Because in all of Millbrook, Virginia, among all those wealthy, powerful, important white people, not a single one knew how to swim. They stood on the shore and watched 3 people die. All except Cyrus Lovett. Cyrus saw Elizabeth's head break the surface for a moment, her arms flailing, her mouth gasping for air. He saw Charlotte bob up briefly before sinking again. And he saw the adults on the shore, paralyzed by their own uselessness. He thought about what his mother had said, that the right thing always has a price. That one day, that price would be paid back. He thought about the whip on his back, the blood in the dirt, the hatred in Edmund's eyes. He thought about letting them drown. 3 white people who had never shown him an ounce of kindness. 3 white people who belonged to a society that considered him less than human. 3 white people whose deaths would not cause a single tear to fall from his eyes. He thought about all of that for exactly 1 second, and then he started running. Cyrus tore off his thin cotton shirt as he sprinted toward the lake. His bare feet, hardened by years without shoes, pounded against the frozen shore. Behind him, he heard someone shout, "What is that boy doing?" He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He ran onto the ice, moving fast and light, his eyes scanning the surface for cracks and weak spots. His months of careful observation paid off now. He knew exactly where to step, exactly where to avoid. 20 feet from the hole, he could see Elizabeth struggling to keep her head above water. Her heavy wool coat was dragging her down. Her movements were growing weaker. 15 feet from the hole, he could see Thomas Jr. floating face down, motionless. 10 feet from the hole, the ice began to crack beneath his feet. Cyrus didn't hesitate. He dove. The cold hit him like a wall of knives. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to get out, to escape, to survive. The water was so cold it felt like burning, so cold his muscles locked up for a terrifying moment, refusing to obey. But Cyrus had spent years swimming in cold rivers. He had trained his body to withstand temperatures that would kill an ordinary person. And he had something else, something no amount of cold could extinguish. He had purpose. He opened his eyes underwater. The lake was murky and dark, but he could see shapes moving in the gloom. He spotted Thomas Jr. first, the boy's blonde hair floating like seaweed as he sank toward the bottom. Cyrus kicked downward, fighting against the cold that was trying to freeze his limbs. He reached Thomas Jr. and grabbed him by the hair. It was the only thing he could grip. Then he turned and swam upward toward the light. The hole in the ice had shifted. The current from the underground spring was pushing the broken pieces around, making the opening smaller. For a terrible moment, Cyrus thought he wouldn't find a way out. But then he saw it. A gap in the ice, just wide enough for a body to pass through. He kicked with all his strength, pulling Thomas Jr. behind him. His lungs were burning. His vision was starting to go black at the edges, but he kept swimming, kept fighting, kept reaching for that tiny window of light above him. He broke the surface with a gasp that tore his throat raw. Hands reached down from the edge of the ice. White hands, belonging to William Whitmore, the same young man who had whipped Cyrus 5 months earlier. William grabbed Thomas Jr. and pulled him out of the water.
"He's alive!"
William shouted.
"He's alive!"
Cyrus clung to the edge of the ice, his body shaking violently. He had been in the water for less than a minute, but already he could feel his strength fading. The cold was seeping into his bones, slowing his thoughts, making his movements clumsy. He could stop now. He had done more than anyone could have expected. He had saved the judge's son. Surely that was enough. But Charlotte was still down there, and so was Elizabeth. Cyrus took 3 deep breaths. Then he let go of the ice and dove back under. Charlotte had sunk deeper than her brother. The current had caught her dress and was pulling her toward the center of the lake, toward the warmth of the underground spring. Cyrus swam after her, his arms cutting through the black water, his eyes straining to see in the darkness. He found her tangled in something. Weeds, maybe, or debris from the lake bed. Her face was pale, her eyes were closed. She wasn't moving. Cyrus grabbed her arm and pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, harder. Still nothing. The weeds had wrapped around her legs, holding her down like chains. He was running out of air. His lungs were screaming at him to go up, to breathe, to save himself. But he couldn't leave her. He couldn't let this child die, at the bottom of a frozen lake. He reached down and tore at the weeds with his bare hands. The cold had made his fingers numb, and he could barely feel what he was doing. But he kept tearing, kept ripping, kept fighting. Until finally, Charlotte came free. Cyrus grabbed her around the waist and kicked upward. But the hole he had used before was gone. The ice had shifted again, and now there was nothing but a solid white ceiling above him. He was trapped. For a moment, Cyrus felt something he had never felt before. Despair. Complete, total, overwhelming despair. He had tried to do the right thing, and the right thing was going to kill him. But then, through the ice, he saw a shadow moving. Someone was up there, crawling on their hands and knees, looking down through the frozen surface. Cyrus punched the ice with his fist. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th punch, a crack appeared. On the 5th, the crack widened, and on the 6th, a hand broke through from above and grabbed his wrist. It was Edmund Ashford. Edmund, who had humiliated him. Edmund, who had caused him to be whipped. Edmund, who called him an animal. Edmund, who was now pulling him and Charlotte through the broken ice, back into the world of the living. Cyrus emerged from the water with Charlotte still clutched against his chest. Hands grabbed her and pulled her onto the solid ice. Someone was shouting that she wasn't breathing. Someone else was pounding on her back, trying to force the water out of her lungs. Cyrus tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He collapsed onto the ice, shivering so hard his teeth rattled in his head. "The teacher," someone said. "The teacher is still down there." Cyrus looked toward the hole. Elizabeth Harrington had been in the water longer than anyone. If she was still alive, she wouldn't be for much longer. He thought about giving up. He had saved 2 people. 2 children who would have died without him. Surely that was enough. Surely no one could expect him to go back into that frozen hell a 3rd time. But then he remembered the way Elizabeth had looked at him. The way she had smiled. The way she had said thank you, as if he were a person deserving of thanks. She had treated him like a human being. And human beings don't abandon each other. Cyrus crawled to the edge of the hole. His body was shutting down. His movements were slow and clumsy. His thoughts were foggy, distant, like he was watching himself from far away. He took one last breath, and he dove. Elizabeth was at the bottom of the lake. Her heavy wool coat had filled with water and dragged her down like an anchor. She was caught on something, her arm twisted at an odd angle, her body motionless. Cyrus swam down to her. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His muscles were failing. His lungs were empty. His heart was slowing in his chest. He reached Elizabeth and grabbed her coat. He pulled. The coat didn't move. Something was holding it. A branch, maybe, or a root from a tree that had fallen into the lake years ago. Cyrus didn't have time to free her gently. He didn't have time for anything, so he did the only thing he could do. He ripped the coat off her body. The buttons tore away. The seams split apart. And Elizabeth Harrington came free, floating upward in her simple white dress like a ghost rising from the grave. Cyrus grabbed her around the waist and kicked. His legs barely responded. His arms felt like lead. But he kicked anyway, again and again, pushing himself toward the surface through sheer force of will. He didn't see the hole. He didn't see the light. He just kept swimming upward, praying he would find a way out before his body gave up completely. His head struck ice. Solid, thick, unbreakable ice. He was trapped again, and this time there was no one above him to help. Cyrus felt his grip on Elizabeth loosening. He felt his eyes closing. He felt the cold wrapping around him like a blanket, pulling him down into the darkness. So this is how I die, he thought, in the cold, in the dark, alone, just like we've always been treated. He stopped struggling. He let the water take him. He began to sink. And then something grabbed his hand. Elizabeth's eyes were open. She was awake. And she was pulling him toward a light he hadn't seen. A crack in the ice, barely visible, just a few feet away. Together they swam toward it. Together they clawed at the ice, breaking it apart with their frozen fingers. Together they burst through the surface, gasping, coughing, crying out in voices that sounded like they came from another world. Hands reached down and pulled them out. Cyrus lay on the ice, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except breathe. The air burned his lungs. The cold burned his skin. Everything burned, but he was alive, and so were the 3 people he had saved. Someone wrapped a coat around him. Someone carried him to the shore. Someone put him next to one of the fires and piled blankets on top of him. He heard voices, distant and muffled, like they were coming from underwater. They saved them. All 3 of them. The boy, the slave boy. How is that possible? Cyrus closed his eyes. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness took him was the sound of Charlotte Miller coughing up water. The sound of life returning to a body that had been moments from death. The sound of a miracle. When Cyrus Lovett opened his eyes, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was made of rough wooden planks. The air smelled like smoke and something medicinal, and there was a face hovering over him. A face he recognized, his mother. Bessie was crying, not the silent tears she usually shed when no one was watching. Real tears, loud tears, the kind of tears that came from a place so deep that no amount of suffering could ever dry them up.
My boy,
she kept saying, over and over. My brave, foolish, beautiful boy. Cyrus tried to speak, but his throat was raw and swollen. He tried to move, but his body felt like it had been filled with sand. He managed to lift one hand, just a few inches off the rough blanket, and Bessie grabbed it like it was the most precious thing in the world. You've been asleep for 2 days, she said. 2 whole days. The fever almost took you. I thought I was going to lose you, baby. I thought the Lord was going to take you from me. Cyrus closed his eyes. 2 days. He had been unconscious for 2 days. Slowly the memories came back. The lake, the ice, the cold that burned like fire, the children sinking into the darkness, Elizabeth's face, pale and lifeless, floating at the bottom. Did they live? He whispered. His voice was barely audible, a croak more than a word. The people I pulled out. Did they live? Bessie squeezed his hand tighter. They lived, she said. All 3 of them, because of you. Cyrus let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. Then he closed his eyes and slept again. The next time he woke, the fever had broken. He was still weak, still exhausted, still aching in places he didn't know could ache. But he was alive. and for the first time since the lake, he could think clearly. He was in the slave quarters on the Whitmore plantation. The same small cabin he had lived in his entire life. The same dirt floor, the same leaky roof, the same thin walls that let in the winter cold. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had changed. Over the next few days, Cyrus learned what had happened after he lost consciousness on the ice. He learned that Thomas Jr. and Charlotte Miller had both survived. Though Charlotte had come very close to death, her heart had stopped for nearly a minute before someone managed to revive her. He learned that Elizabeth Harrington was alive, but badly weakened, confined to bed in the Miller mansion, where she was being cared for by the family doctor. And he learned that his name was being whispered all over Millbrook. The enslaved people talked about him in hushed, reverent tones. They called him a hero. They said he had done something no white man in the county had the courage to do. They said God had given him a gift, and he had used that gift to save lives. The white people talked about him too, but in very different tones. Some called him brave, some called him foolish, and some, the ones who understood what his actions truly meant, called him dangerous, because Cyrus Lovett had done something that challenged the entire foundation of their world. He had proven, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that a black person could be more courageous, more selfless, more heroic than any of the white people who claimed to be his superiors. And that was a truth they could not allow to stand. Thomas Whitmore came to see Cyrus on the 5th day after the rescue. He stood in the doorway of the slave cabin, his face unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. "I hear you're feeling better," he said. "Yes, sir," Cyrus replied. He kept his eyes down, the way he had been taught. He kept his voice soft and deferential. But inside, something had changed. Something had hardened. "What you did on that lake," Whitmore continued, "it was unexpected." Cyrus said nothing. "The Miller children would have died without you, the judge's own son and daughter. Do you understand what that means?" Cyrus understood exactly what it meant. It meant that the most powerful man in Millbrook owed his children's lives to a slave boy. It meant that every time Judge Miller looked at Thomas Jr. and Charlotte, he would be reminded of what Cyrus had done. It meant that the natural order of things, the order that said white people were superior and black people were inferior, had been turned upside down in the most dramatic way imaginable. Whitmore was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Cyrus. "The judge wants to see you. When you're well enough to walk, you're to present yourself at the Miller mansion." Cyrus looked up, forgetting for a moment to keep his eyes down.
Why?
"That's not for you to question, boy. Just do as you're told." And with that, Thomas Whitmore turned and walked away. Cyrus went to the Miller mansion on the 10th day after the rescue. His legs were still weak, and his lungs still burned when he breathed too deeply. But he walked the 3 miles from the Whitmore plantation to the Miller estate without complaint, wearing his cleanest shirt and his only pair of shoes. The mansion was the largest building in Millbrook, 3 stories tall, with white columns in front and windows that gleamed like diamonds in the winter sun. Cyrus had never been inside. Enslaved people entered through the back, through the servants' quarters, through the parts of the house the family never had to see. But today, for reasons no one explained to him, Cyrus was led through the front door. The entryway was bigger than the entire cabin, where Cyrus lived. The floors were polished marble. The walls were covered with paintings of stern-looking white men in old-fashioned clothes. And at the far end of the hall, sitting in a chair that looked almost like a throne, was Judge Cornelius Miller. The judge was a large man, broad-shouldered and heavy, set, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of disapproval. He had small dark eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that rarely smiled. He was, by all accounts, the most feared man in Millbrook. And right now, those small dark eyes were fixed on Cyrus. "Come closer," the judge said. Cyrus walked forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He stopped a few feet from the judge's chair and stood with his head bowed, waiting. "Look at me," the judge commanded. Cyrus looked up. It was the first time he had ever looked a white man directly in the eyes without being punished for it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Judge Miller did something Cyrus never expected. He stood up, and he extended his hand. Cyrus stared at the hand like it was a snake that might bite him. White men did not shake hands with slaves. It simply wasn't done. It was against every rule of the society they lived in, against every law of nature that men like Judge Miller believed in. "Take it," the judge said. His voice was strained, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "You saved my children's lives. The least I can do is shake your hand." The Cyrus reached out slowly, carefully, and took the judge's hand. The handshake lasted only a second. Then Judge Miller pulled away, as if the contact had burned him. "I am told," the judge continued, "that you tried to warn someone about the ice, that you told old Johnson the eastern shore was dangerous." "Yes, sir," Cyrus said. "You saw the crack. You knew the spring underneath made the ice thin." "Yes, sir. And no one listened to you." "No, sir." The judge was silent for a moment. Then he said, "They should have." It was the closest thing to an admission of fault Cyrus had ever heard from a white man. "I have spoken with Thomas Whitmore," the judge continued. "I have asked him to treat you fairly, as a reward for what you did." Cyrus felt a spark of hope flare in his chest. Did that mean freedom? Did that mean he would be allowed to leave, to go north, to start a new life? But the next words crushed that hope like a boot crushing an insect. "You will remain his property." "Of course," the judge said. "The law is the law, and I cannot change that. But I have made it clear that you are not to be whipped again, not for any reason, and you will be given extra rations and a new set of clothes." That was it. That was the reward for saving 3 lives. Extra food and a new shirt. Cyrus wanted to scream. He wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. He wanted to ask the judge how he could stand there, shaking the hand of the boy who had saved his children, and still refuse to give that boy his freedom. But he said none of those things. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." Because that was what you did when you were a slave. You swallowed your anger. You buried your pride. You said thank you for scraps from the master's table and pretended to be grateful. But Cyrus was not grateful, and he was not going to forget. The judge dismissed him after that. Cyrus walked back through the grand entryway, past the marble floors and the oil paintings, and out into the cold January air. And that was when he saw her. Elizabeth Harrington was sitting on a bench near the side of the house, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw Cyrus, she smiled. "They let you out of bed," Cyrus said, surprised. "I insisted," Elizabeth replied. "I heard you were coming, and I wanted to see you." Cyrus didn't know what to say. No white person had ever wanted to see him before. Not like this. Not as an equal. "Sit with me," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the empty space on the bench beside her. "Please." Cyrus hesitated. If anyone saw him sitting next to a white woman, there would be consequences. Serious consequences. The kind of consequences that involved whips and chains, and worse. But Elizabeth was looking at him with those same eyes that had looked at him in the street all those months ago. Eyes that saw him as a person. Eyes that did not judge him by the color of his skin. He sat down. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, looking out at the frozen garden, listening to the winter birds calling from the bare trees. Then Elizabeth said, "You saved my life." Cyrus nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him why. Everyone just assumed that a slave would do whatever was necessary to please his masters. That saving white lives was simply what was expected of him. But Elizabeth wasn't asking what was expected. She was asking what was true. Cyrus thought about the question for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you looked at me." Elizabeth frowned. "What do you mean?" "In the street," he said. "When you dropped your books. You looked at me like I was a person, like I mattered. No white person ever did that before." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "And for that," she said, her voice breaking, "you risked your life." Cyrus looked at her. For the first time since the lake, he felt something other than anger and resentment. He felt connection. He felt understanding. "You risked yours too," he said. "You went after those children. You didn't have to. You could have stayed on the shore like everyone else. But you didn't." Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the corner of her blanket. "I couldn't just watch them drown." "Neither could I." They sat in silence again. Then Elizabeth said something that would change everything. "I'm leaving Millbrook." Cyrus looked at her in surprise. "Where are you going?" "New York," she said. "I have friends there. People who believe in the cause. People who want to end slavery." She paused, then continued. "I'm going to tell them what happened here. I'm going to tell them about you, Cyrus. About what you did, about how a 12-year-old black boy was braver than every white man in this county combined." Cyrus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If she did that, if she told the newspapers in the North about what had happened, it would cause trouble. Big trouble. For him, for his mother, for everyone. "That could be dangerous," he said. Elizabeth nodded. "I know. But the truth is always dangerous to people who profit from lies, and the lie that black people are inferior, that they are less than human, that they deserve to be enslaved." She shook her head. "That lie needs to die, and maybe your story can help kill it." Cyrus didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as part of something bigger. He had just been trying to survive, one day at a time, in a world that wanted to break him. But maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe there was something more. Elizabeth left Millbrook 3 days later. She slipped away in the middle of the night, without saying goodbye to anyone except Cyrus. She left him a note, hidden in the hollow of an old tree near the river, where they had arranged to leave messages for each other. The note said simply, "Remember who you are. The world will know your name." Cyrus kept that note hidden in his shoe for months. Every time he felt the paper against his foot, he remembered Elizabeth's words. And he waited. The article appeared in the New York Tribune on March 15, 1858. It was written by a journalist named Frederick Hawthorne, who had heard the story from Elizabeth and had done his own investigation to verify the facts. The headline read, "The Shame of the South, When a Slave is More Human Than His Masters." The article described the events at Lake Miller in vivid detail. It described how Cyrus had tried to warn the white people about the dangerous ice and been ignored. It described how the wealthy, powerful adults had stood paralyzed on the shore while 3 people drowned, and it described how a 12-year-old enslaved boy had done what none of them could do. The article did not just report the facts. It asked questions. Hard questions. Questions that struck at the very heart of the Southern way of life. If the Negro is truly inferior, Hawthorne wrote, how do we explain the courage of young Cyrus Lovett? If the Negro is truly incapable of noble action, How do we explain his willingness to sacrifice his own life for people who had shown him nothing but cruelty? And if the Negro is truly deserving of bondage, how do we explain the moral cowardice of the white men who stood by and watched their own children die? The article spread like wildfire. It was reprinted in newspapers across the North. It was read aloud in abolitionist meetings. It was discussed in churches and schools and town halls from Boston to Chicago. And the name Cyrus Lovett became famous. In Millbrook, the reaction was very different. Thomas Whitmore read the article with a face that grew redder with every word. When he finished, he threw the newspaper into the fire and stormed out of his house, heading for the slave quarters. He found Cyrus chopping wood behind the main cabin.
You!
Whitmore snarled. You did this. You talked to that Yankee teacher. You told her what to write. Cyrus kept his eyes down. He kept his voice calm. I didn't write anything, sir. I just did what I did. You made us look like fools? Whitmore shouted. You made me look like a fool in front of the whole country. Cyrus said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth was the truth, and no amount of anger could change it. Whitmore raised his hand as if to strike. Then he remembered the judge's warning. No whipping. Not for any reason. The judge had been clear, and even Thomas Whitmore was not foolish enough to cross Judge Cornelius Miller. Whitmore lowered his hand, but his eyes were full of hatred. You're going to pay for this, he said. One way or another. He walked away, leaving Cyrus standing in the cold, his breath misting in the air. Cyrus knew the threat was real. He knew that Whitmore would find a way to punish him, judge or no judge. But something had changed inside him. The fear that had ruled his life for so long was fading. In its place was something new. Defiance. Let them try, he thought. Let them do their worst. The whole world knows what I did. The whole world knows who I am, and they can never take that away. The weeks that followed were tense. Cyrus was watched constantly. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every word he spoke was reported back to Whitmore, but no one touched him. No one dared, because the eyes of the North were on Millbrook now, and any violence against the boy who had saved the Miller children would only prove what the abolitionists were saying about the South. In April, something unexpected happened. Judge Miller summoned Cyrus to the mansion again. This time, the meeting was not in the grand entryway. It was in the judge's private study, behind closed doors. The judge looked older than he had 2 months earlier. Tired, worn down. I have received letters, he said. Hundreds of letters, from people in the North. People I have never met. People who read about what you did. He picked up a stack of papers from his desk. Some of them want to buy your freedom. They are offering money. More money than Thomas Whitmore paid for you in the first place. Cyrus felt his heart stop. Freedom. They were offering him freedom. But then he saw the expression on the judge's face, and he knew. I told them no, the judge said. I told them that the laws of Virginia do not permit the sale of slaves to Northern abolitionists. I told them that you are property, and property does not have the right to be sold to the highest bidder. He put the letters down. I want you to understand something, boy. What you did on that lake does not change what you are. You are a slave. You will always be a slave, and no amount of Northern sentiment can change that. The Cyrus looked at the judge for the first time. He did not look away. Is that all, sir? He asked. The judge seemed surprised by the question, by the steadiness in Cyrus's voice, by the lack of fear in his eyes. Yes, he said finally. That is all. Cyrus turned and walked out of the study. He walked through the grand entryway, past the marble floors and the oil paintings, and out into the spring sunshine, and for the first time in his life, he smiled. Because the judge was wrong. He was not going to be a slave forever. The letters from the North proved it. The articles in the newspapers proved it. The whole world was waking up to the truth, and no amount of Virginia law could stop it. The war was coming. Everyone could feel it. The tension between North and South had been building for years, and the incident at Lake Miller was just one more spark in a powder keg that was about to explode. Cyrus did not know when freedom would come. He did not know if he would live to see it. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that it would come. And when it did, he would be ready. The final chapter of this story takes place 3 years later, in the spring of 1861. The Civil War had begun. Fort Sumter had fallen, and across the South, the world that men like Thomas Whitmore and Judge Miller had built was starting to crumble. Cyrus was 15 now, taller, stronger, more determined than ever. He had spent the years since the lake learning everything he could. He had taught himself to read, using a Bible that Elizabeth Harrington had left behind. He had learned about the Underground Railroad, about the routes north, about the safe houses where escaped slaves could find shelter. And he had made a plan. On the night of May 3rd, 1861, Cyrus Lovett ran. He slipped away from the Whitmore plantation in the darkest hour of the night, moving through the woods with the silence and speed of a ghost. He crossed the Ashford River at the same spot where his mother had taught him to swim, and he headed north, toward the Union lines, toward freedom. He was not alone. Bessie went with him, and so did a dozen other enslaved people from the Whitmore plantation, all of them following the boy who had given them hope. They traveled for weeks. Moving by night, hiding by day, they faced hunger and cold and the constant fear of capture. But they kept moving, kept fighting, kept believing that freedom was waiting for them on the other side. And on the morning of June 15th, 1861, they crossed into Pennsylvania. Free soil, free air, free at last. Cyrus fell to his knees and wept. Bessie knelt beside him, holding him in her arms, crying tears of joy that she had held back for 40 years. "You did it," she whispered. "My brave, beautiful boy. You did it." Cyrus looked up at the sky. The sun was rising, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "We did it," he said. "Together." Cyrus Lovett lived to see the end of the Civil War. He lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States. And he lived to see the country he had been born into begin the long, painful process of reckoning with its past. He never forgot what happened at Lake Miller. He never forgot the 3 people he had saved, and he never forgot the lesson his mother had taught him all those years ago. The right thing always has a price in this world. But one day, that price will be paid back, with interest. The people of Millbrook tried to forget what Cyrus had done. They tried to bury the story, to pretend it never happened, to erase his name from their history. But stories have a way of surviving. The article in the New York Tribune was preserved in libraries across the North. The letters from abolitionists were collected and published, and the name Cyrus Lovett became a symbol of something that no amount of denial could destroy. The truth. The truth that courage has no color. The truth that humanity cannot be measured by the shade of a person's skin. The truth that the people who called themselves superior were often the most inferior of all. Edmund Ashford, the boy who had tormented Cyrus and then helped pull him from the ice, grew up to be a Confederate soldier. He was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, fighting to preserve a way of life that had already been condemned by history. William Whitmore, who had whipped Cyrus and then saved Thomas Jr. from the frozen lake, survived the war, but never recovered from it. He spent the rest of his life drinking and gambling, haunted by memories he could never escape. Thomas Jr. and Charlotte Miller both lived long lives. Thomas became a doctor. Charlotte became a teacher. And according to family records, neither of them ever forgot the black boy who had pulled them from the frozen waters of their father's lake. Judge Cornelius Miller died in 1867, 2 years after the war ended. His final words, according to his wife Margaret, were a question. "Do you think he forgave me?" he asked the boy. "Do you think he forgave me?" Margaret did not know how to answer. As for Cyrus himself, he settled in Philadelphia after the war. He married a woman named Sarah, a former slave from Maryland, and they had 4 children together. He worked as a carpenter, building houses for the growing population of freed black people who were making new lives in the North. He never learned to hate the people who had enslaved him. Hatred, he believed, was a chain heavier than any made of iron. He chose instead to focus on the future, on building something better for his children and his children's children. But he never stopped telling his story. Every year on January 14th, the anniversary of the rescue, Cyrus would gather his family around the fire and tell them about the day he dove into the frozen lake. He would tell them about the cold that burned like fire, about the darkness at the bottom of the water, about the moment when he thought he was going to die, and he would tell them about the choice he made. "I could have let them drown," he would say. "Nobody would have blamed me. Nobody would have expected me to save people who treated me like an animal." He would pause, looking into the faces of his children, making sure they understood. "But I didn't let them drown. Because if I had, I would have become like them. I would have let hatred and anger turn me into something less than human. And I refused to do that. I refused to let them take my humanity, even if they took everything else." His children would listen in silence. And when he finished, they would ask the same question they always asked. "Was it worth it, Papa? Was it worth risking your life for people who didn't care about you?" And Cyrus would smile and say the same thing every time. "It wasn't about them. It was about me, about who I wanted to be, about the kind of person I wanted to see when I looked in the mirror." He would lean back in his chair, his eyes distant, remembering. "I couldn't control what they did to me, but I could control what I did, and I chose to be better than they were. I chose to be human, even when they treated me like I wasn't. That was my revenge. Not violence, not hatred, just being better. And they could never take that away from me." Cyrus Lovett died in 1902 at the age of 56. He was buried in a small cemetery in Philadelphia, next to his wife Sarah, who had passed away 3 years earlier. His gravestone was simple. Just his name, his dates, and a single line of text that he had requested himself. It read, "He saved 3 souls and kept his own." The world has largely forgotten Cyrus Lovett. His name does not appear in most history books. His story is not taught in most schools. He was just one boy in one small town in a country that was full of injustice and cruelty and pain. But his story matters. It matters because it reminds us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. It matters because it shows us that the people society dismisses as inferior are often the most extraordinary of all. And it matters because it proves that even in the darkest times, even in the coldest waters, the human spirit can rise. Cyrus Lovett dove into a frozen lake on a January afternoon in 1858. He did it knowing that the people he saved would never truly appreciate it. He did it knowing that the world he lived in would never give him the recognition he deserved. He did it knowing that he might die. He did it anyway, because that's what heroes do, not for glory, not for reward, not even for gratitude, but because it's right. And in a world that so often rewards cruelty and punishes kindness, that simple act of doing what was right was the most revolutionary thing of all. This has been the story of Cyrus Lovett, the boy who dove into the frozen lake, the boy who saved 3 souls, the boy who refused to let hatred win.